Here, I'm sure, as we get going, but we're going to get going now. Introducing Bob Kendrick. He's the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. And we talked earlier kind of about Negro Leagues in general, the importance of people knowing about it. But here in Texas, the history of the Negro Leagues runs very deep. What can you tell us about the history of the Negro Leagues here in Texas?
Well, Texas has always had a tremendous connection to the Negro Leagues, even though they didn't actually have a team that was a former member of the so-called organized Negro Leagues, but so many tremendous ball players that came out of this great state. And of course, the team that we're celebrating tonight, the Dallas Black Giants, a semi-pro baseball team that the legendary Ernie Banks started his career with this team. And the legendary James Thomas Cool Papa Bell saw Ernie playing here in Dallas for the Dallas Black Giants, called Buck O'Neill and said, "Buck, I got one for you." And Buck's response was, "Can he pick it?" Cool said, "Yeah, he can pick it." And Buck O'Neill signs Ernie Banks, sight unseen, based on Cool Papa Bell's recommendation. Now, if Cool Papa Bell recommends you probably can play. And of course, Calvert, Texas, the home to the legendary Andrew Rude Foster, who would establish the Negro Leagues in Kansas City in 1920. Rude's brother, Willie Foster, both are in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. The legendary Smokey Joe Williams from Seguin, Texas. So the list of great Texas ball players, Willie the Devil Wells, or El Diablo from Austin, Texas. You know, so Texas' connection to the Negro Leagues runs very deep and absolutely significant.
There are a lot of guys, as you mentioned, but Ernie Banks really is that big name.
He's the name.
When you hear Ernie Banks, what comes to mind for you?
Oh, it makes me smile. It makes me smile because if you knew Ernie Banks and you never met Buck O'Neill, well, you met Buck O'Neill because Ernie Banks was the embodiment of the spirit of Buck O'Neill. Ernie was Buck's surrogate son. And so when Buck signed Ernie and the late great William Blake, William Skinny Legs Blake, the longtime publisher of the Elite newspaper, still being published to this day, they put Ernie on the bus and sent him to Kansas City. Mr. Blair bought him 2 suits and sent him to Kansas City to go join the Kansas City Monarchs. And Buck O'Neill basically, he mentored Ernie and taught him social graces, taught him how to dress, and that funny disposition that we all knew and loved about Ernie Banks, that was Buck O'Neill. Yeah, Ernie was very shy and reserved, which is hard to believe if you knew Ernie Banks because he never stopped talking. Yeah, and he was very shy and reserved when he first got to Kansas City. And then Buck helped bring out that personality. Now, Ernie would say that Buck O'Neill taught him how to play. Buck would say, no, Ernie already knew how to play. What Buck did was he taught Ernie how to love the game. And that love of the game kind of spewed out after he got to Chicago. But interestingly enough, when the Cubs signed Ernie, Ernie did not want to leave the Monarchs. He was very comfortable playing in Kansas City. I think Ernie realized that once he left the Negro Leagues to go to the major leagues, he's now going to be in an isolated world. See, when he was playing for the Monarchs, when the ball game was over, all of those guys were going to get together, they were going to go have dinner, they were going to go to the nightclub, listen to jazz, and he was afraid of being isolated, which absolutely was real. When he gets to the Cubs, now he is isolated. He's relegated to the South Side, where they had to stay. And so eventually things started to change. He became obviously readily accepted by his Cubs teammates, and he became this very gregarious, outgoing player that we knew and loved, and one of the greatest shortstops in baseball history. But it all began in the Negro Leagues with the great Kansas City Monarchs.
You mentioned no skinny legs player, a guy who played for the Dallas Black Giants, is such, or was such a wonderful part of this Dallas community. His son, Daryl, has worked with us, and he's been fantastic, someone who you know well. When you think of William Skinny Legs player, what comes to mind?
Again, I smile because I always enjoyed being around Mr. Blair. Number one, he had great stories of his time in the Negro Leagues, and to come here to Dallas and to just hang out and be around him was something that I always enjoyed and looked forward to. He was a founding member of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, so he spent a lot of time in Kansas City, helped us organize this idea of building a museum, and helped us grow this museum. And so, but to hear he and Buckle Neal together trading stories, I was like a kid in a candy store, and you would just sit there and listen and try to absorb everything that they were sharing with you. And so now, as I continue to tell these stories, guys like Mr. Blair, Buckle Neal, Ernie Banks, all these guys are part of who I am. They are embedded in my heart. And so every time that I tell these stories, I feel as if I am keeping them alive. Their spirit is still alive. And that's what that museum in Kansas City represents.
I feel like that's such an embodiment of the Negro Leagues. There wasn't a lot of TV, there wasn't a lot of video. It all kind of survived in the stories and the wonderful, heartwarming stories that you heard about these players. I'd love to say some names and just have you tell some stories. And well, that's no other guy to start with than Jackie Robinson. What comes to mind?
Yeah, well, he's back. He's wearing that 1945 Jackie Robinson Kansas City Monarch home jersey. And so before Jackie was number 42, he was number 5. But a lot of people did not know that Jackie Robinson's illustrious career began in the Negro Leagues. I do think people think that Jackie just walked out of nowhere and started playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers, but his real rookie season was in Kansas City in 1945. And Jackie was a good ball player, but when Jackie joined the Monarchs, there was really no fanfare around Jackie. I got to know several of his former teammates that were with him in 1945, and they would all tell you that Jackie was just another ball player trying to make the Monarchs team. Quite frankly, had it not been for World War II, I'm not sure Jackie would have ever gotten invited to try out for the Monarchs. Jackie had been honorably discharged from the Army here in Texas, at Fort Hood, Texas, where he had been court-martialed, but he wins his court-martial case because he refused to give up a seat on the bus to a white person. And they tried to court-martial Jackie, but he wins his court-martial trial. He is honorably discharged. Well, he writes to the Kansas City Monarchs owner, James Leslie Wilkerson, J.L. Wilkerson, or a.k.a. Wilkie, as he was affectionately known, and asked for a tryout under the recommendation of another great Texan ball player, Hilton Smith. Hilton Smith is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Hilton Smith attended Prairie View A&M. Hilton Smith did something, guys, that I don't think we will ever see done again in the game of baseball. He won 20 games or more, 12 consecutive years. I don't think that will ever happen again. And so Jackie writes to J.L. Wilkerson. Wilkerson grants him a tryout. They try him out in Houston, Texas. He makes the Monarchs team. But in 1945, so many of the great Monarch stars were serving in World War II. So Buckle Neal was in the Navy. A guy by the name of Hank Thompson. Hank Thompson holds the distinction of integrating 2 major league teams. He integrated the St. Louis Browns and the New York Giants. So he's with the Giants before Willie Mays or Monty Irvin. He's serving in the Army. A ball player by the name of Willard Brown. Willard Brown is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Willard Brown was nicknamed Home Run Brown by Josh Gibson. Now, if Josh Gibson nicknamed you Home Run Brown, you got to have some power. And Willard Brown was a do-it-all outfielder for the Kansas City Monarchs. He's in the Army. A guy named Ted Strong. Ted Strong, for those of you who are baseball fans, was Dave Winfield before we ever knew who Dave Winfield was. Ted Strong was 6 feet 7 inches tall, weighed about 230, was a freakish athlete, played every position except for pitcher and catcher. He's a 6'7" shortstop. And when he wasn't playing for the Monarchs, he starred for the Harlem Globetrotters. He's serving in the Navy. So if the Monarchs have their full roster intact, Jackie Robinson never gets invited to try out. And how would history have been altered? Well, Wilkinson signs him, and little did he know he had just signed a man that was going to put him out of business, because by the end of the 45 season, Jackie was gone, and as we now know, he was meeting with Branch Rickey, where the two of them would make the epic decision that Jackie Robinson would become the chosen one, the man that would break Major League Baseball's 6-decade-long self-imposed color barrier. Jackie Robinson's breaking of the color barrier wasn't just a part of the civil rights movement, it was the beginning of the civil rights movement in this country. But it also spelled the end of the Negro League.
If you're just joining us, this is Bob Kendrick. He's the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. A great storyteller, of course. And we continue. I would love to hear a story that you have about Josh Gibson, who you mentioned.
Josh Gibson, who I think easily is the greatest combination of power and average this game has ever seen. People focus, and I can understand why, they focus on the tremendous power, and he was. He swung a 40-ounce, 41-inch bat. And guys, when you look at the pictures of Josh, he is not choking up on that bat. He's got it gripped down below the knob. Big, powerful forearms, big, powerful thighs, and great eyes. Buck O'Neil would describe Josh Gibson in this manner, that he had the power of Babe Ruth and the eyes of Ted Williams rolled into one dynamic eye. We're talking about a guy who had a lifetime batting average of 354, and in head-to-head competition against major leaguers in countless exhibition games, hit over 420. What makes it even more remarkable as fans of his game, he was doing this as a catcher. Catchers don't do that. No. You get one or the other, power or average, but rarely do you get the combination of the two because the position is so physically demanding. It beats your body up. And folks, Josh Gibson wasn't a good catcher. He was a great catcher. Rifle arm. So he is throwing guys out from the crowd. Back in that era, Buckhead had complete control of his pitching staff, so he called a great game, was a good running catcher. He's going to steal you 20, 25 bases or more to go with that big battlefield. And so I don't know if there's another player that you can actually compare to Josh Gibson. He was that, he is still believed to be the only man to ever hit a ball completely out of Yankee Stadium. He hit one in the Polo Grounds to straight dead center field that they estimated to travel over 600 feet. The man was just one of those guys that was so strong, and he was a jolly giant of a man. I don't know if he realized how strong he really was. He's the kind of guy that could poke you on the shoulder and it hurt. Yeah, because he wasn't trying to hurt you. He was just that strong.
Well, one of the most legendary guys in all of the Negro Leagues has to be Satchel Paige. There are more legends about him and more stories about him than any other player. What's your favorite?
Oh my God, there are so many great stories of Satchel. I think that he's the greatest pitcher of all time. And the reason I say that is there may have been others who threw just as hard. There may have been others who had great stuff. But when you combine what Satchel had, you combine the longevity. By his estimation, he pitched over 2,600 games. The great stuff. some 55 no-hitters, and only God knows how many strikeouts, along with the charisma. He could sell it. Yeah, he could sell it. You know, he would ride into towns and the entire town would shut down to see the old man hit. And Satchel, y'all, had names for his pitches. So he didn't have fastball, curveball, changeup. Not Satchel. Satchel had what he called his midnight creeper. He had the two-humper. He had the back dodger. He had the hesitation pitch. He had the long time, the short time, the jump ball, the trouble ball, the radio ball, the wobbly ball, the dipsy-do. And he also had a pitch that he famously called his B-ball. You know why he called it a B-ball?
Why do that?
Because Satchel says, it bees where I want it to be, when I want it to be there. And so every time I have a young major leaguer pitcher that comes into the museum, I tell them they all need to make sure that they develop themselves a B-ball. So one of my favorite Satchel stories, I first heard the story from the legendary Dodger broadcaster, Vince Scully. And so I had it verified by Whitey Herzog. And so the year is 1956. Now, if you believe that Satchel was born in 1906, which I absolutely do not believe, this would make him 50 years old. And so Bill Vetter, at that time, owned the Miami Marlins, AAA team. And he brings the old man back to pitch for the Marlins at either age 50, which means he was likely closer to 60. And so Satchel is pitching highly effectively for the Marlins. Well, they're playing in Rochester, New York. And so the Rochester team had a knothole in the outfield wall. And so they had a promotion that said if any batter could hit the ball on the fly through the knothole, you could win $100,000. Well, it was virtually impossible. But Mr. Herzog was a young outfielder for the Rochester, for the Miami Marlins. And so he says he's out in the outfield jogging when he decides to take some baseballs just to see if the ball would actually fit in a knothole, where there's just enough circumference to squeeze that ball through the knothole. He goes and gets Satchel. He says, Satchel, you always bragging about how great your control is, because as great a pitcher and as dominant a fastball as Satchel had, what really made Satchel special was his control, pinpoint control. So you always bragging about how great your control is and how you can throw a baseball over a chewing gum wrapper. Now this is true. The catcher would sit a stick of foil chewing gum wrapper on top of home plate. And wherever the catcher moved the chewing gum wrapper, Satchel right over the top of that chewing gum wrapper. So you bragging about how great the control is, how you throw a baseball over a chewing gum wrapper. Well, I bet you a bottle of old granddad bourbon that you may throw a baseball through that knothole. Now, Satchel had a nickname for everybody. His nickname, famously for Mr. Herzog, was Wild Child. He says, Wild Child, will the ball fit? Mr. Herzog showed him it's just enough circumference to squeeze that baseball through that knothole. Satchel says, Wild Child, I'll take that bet. And so Mr. Herzog says he steps off 60 feet, 6 inches, puts down the pitching rubber. He's going to give the old man 3 tries to throw that ball through the knothole. He says Satchel takes the baseball like a hunter is looking through the telescope of his rifle, and he measures. And he says the first pitch goes in the hole but spins back out. He says he's in freaking disbelief. But he's saying to himself, well, there's no way he's getting closer than that. The very next pitch, right through the hole. Satchel reaches down, picks up the bottle of bourbon, and says, Wild Child, I'll take that, and saunters on off into the sunset. That's why I say there will never, ever, ever be another Leroy Satchel thing.
I love that. That's perfect. Well, how are you going to top that with Cool Papa Bell? What do you have?
Well, what we know is that Cool Papa, number one, the greatest nickname in baseball history. And particularly in a league that was filled with great nicknames. If you didn't have a great nickname in the Negro League, you probably couldn't play. And Cool Papa, for me, is the greatest nickname of all time. And it really matched his personality. Cool was really cool. Jazzy, snapper dresser, dapper dresser, and he's still believed to be the fastest man to ever play this game. Folks, they clocked him circling the bases from home to home in an amazing 12 seconds. Yeah. Satchel said of his friend that he was so fast he could walk in the room, turn off the lights, get in bed, pull up the covers before the room went dark. And that is actually a true story. But as I tell my guests all the time, you do not have to fictionalize the speed of Cool Papa Bell. Cool Papa Bell, y'all, once stole 175 bases in a less than 200 game season. He twice, honest to God's truth, twice scored from first base on a bunt in exhibition games against Major League All-Stars. See, plays like the bunt and run, hit and run, created, perfected, later picked up by Major League Baseball. Buck O'Neil says they were playing in Mexico, and Cool goes from first to third so fast on a single that the Mexican team stopped the game in protest because they swore he had cut across the diamond, that no man could get around the bases that fast. How fast was Cool Papa Bell?
How fast was he?
The legendary Jesse Owens, who at that time was the fastest man in the world, would never race Cool Papa Bell. Flat out refused to race Cool Papa Bell. Jesse Owens, y'all, would race horses around the bases, but never Cool Papa Bell.
12 seconds around the bases, that's 1.7 seconds faster than the fastest ever recorded in the StatCast era.
And he wasn't just a fast guy. There were a lot of fast guys that have played this game. Cool Papa Bell is likely the greatest base runner this game has ever seen. He had the uncanny ability to cut the bag on the inside, where most guys had to take that big round turn. Cool is on the inside, and he was so adept at running the bases that he would hit first base with his left foot on the inside of the bag, and he's pushing off with his left foot. So while he's on the inside, most guys had to be on the outside, and he was able to shave off nearly 2 seconds compared to most fast guys.
I want to finish it out with a legend, Major League Baseball as well, Willie Mays.
Willie Mays, the Say Hey Kid. But before he was the Say Hey Kid, his nickname was Buck, Young Buck, because he started his career playing for the Birmingham Black Barons, patrolling center field when he was 17 years old. And a few years ago, I'm out in San Francisco, and Mr. Mays was at the ballpark, and they had arranged for me to have a private moment with Mr. Mays down in the players' garage. And I was being hosted by a radio personality there in San Francisco, and he asked Mr. Mays, he says, "Willie, did you ever face Satchel Paige?" And Mr. Mays lights up like a Christmas tree. And if you ever heard Mr. Mays talk, he has a very high-pitched voice. He said, "Yeah, I faced Satchel. I faced Satchel when I was 17 years old." Honest God's truth. 17 years old, playing for the Birmingham Black Barons. The first time I faced Satchel, I got a double off of it. Well, Satchel didn't know who this kid was. He grooves one in, Mr. Mays hits it in the gap, gets a double. Satchel looks over at third base, he says, "Hey, the next time up, let me know. Let me know the next time he comes up." And so a couple innings later, here comes young Willie Mays. He says, "Son, I ain't gonna try to trick you, I'm gonna throw you 3 fastballs." Mr. Mays said to himself, "You gonna throw me 3 fastballs?" He said he threw 3 straight right by me. I never saw him. And as I turned to walk to the dugout, Satchel steps off the mound and says, "Now go sit down, little boy." And here was arguably the greatest major leaguer of all time, absolutely delighting, remembering being struck out by Satchel Paige, which tells you how talented Satchel Paige was. Both of them, of course, are natives of Alabama, Satchel from Mobile, Willie Mays from just outside of Birmingham, and they had a great connection. But Willie Mays would go on from playing center field with the Birmingham Black Bears to become arguably the greatest major leaguer of all time.
He's Bob Kendrick, the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri. Bob, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, guys, thanks so much for having me.